What's up guys, happy new year and welcome to our tutorial for the month of January. In this one we're going to be talking about rim light, bounce light, and ambient light. These are kind of like the secondary lighting scenarios that you don't see nearly as often as direct light, but they're still equally as important. So in this slightly more advanced tutorial, I want to take you guys through the basics of these different lighting scenarios, how they work, and where you can implement them in your paintings. I'll show you guys some examples of real life pictures and paintings and explain to you guys why these lighting scenarios exist where they do. And finally, at the end, I'm going to go through a little demonstration for you guys so that you guys can see how to apply these lighting scenarios onto your characters. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into this advanced tutorial for lighting. Now, the first lighting scenario that we're going to start off with is rim light. Rim lighting basically refers to when there is a light source behind your subject. And this light source is going to be casting a light onto the backside of the subject that you're looking at. This here is where you're viewing your subject from. As a result of this unique positioning, all you're going to see is a bright rim on this side of your subject. In some of these examples, you can see the light source is right here, so that means the brightest part of this light is going to be cast onto the side and the back of our subject, and all we're going to be able to see from the front is a slight bright rim highlighting the silhouette of our character. So this lighting scenario, rim lighting, is basically referring to the angle from which your character is being lit. Now here's a really good example to get this point across. This sphere is being lit from the front in the first example, but in the second example here we can see rim light occurring on the right side of the sphere, and the only difference between these two drawings is the angle from which we're viewing them. We've basically circled around to the back of this sphere, and this light surface on the sphere is now at the back of this sphere, and as a result of which we're seeing a very bright rim along the silhouette of this sphere. Now, once we understand how this works, we can place a light source behind our subject, and we can apply a bright rim highlighting the silhouette of our character. Now, you have to keep in mind that this lighting coming from the back does not form a perfect uniform edge around your character. You have to think of it as a primary light source that's literally casting itself onto all the surfaces of your character, and you just happen to be viewing it from an angle where you can barely see any of the light. So in our case, if the lighting is coming from a rear kind of 3/4 angle, we can assume that some of it is going to be cast onto the side of the head, and as the shape of the skull wraps around the temple, the light will not be able to reach this side. So we'll likely be getting some light on the cheekbone, following down to the shape of the cheek, and it's going to trail off as you get to the jawline. You're going to get some of that lighting on the neck and some of the same lighting applied to the shoulders. Again, we should always be thinking of the form of the subject that the lighting is being applied to, because one mistake that I see a lot of people make when it comes to rim light is they just make it too uniform, and it ends up looking stiff and quite unnatural. So here you can see we're following the contours and the three-dimensional shapes of a human head. Now I'm going to apply a rim light to the back of the ear, and in scenarios like this, you're also going to get some penetration of this light. You're going to see some subsurface scattering. So in a surface that's fleshy like the ear, you're going to really be able to see the light go through the flesh and bring out the red color of our blood vessels. And you can really make this quite saturated as long as your light source is strong. And as more of a stylistic touch, you might also find more subsurface scattering in the area where the light meets the shadow. Just like that. Very, very simplified, but here is an effective application of rim lighting. Now onto our second lighting scenario. Bear with me here because we have to understand how these lighting scenarios work in order to apply them effectively. So bounce light is quite self-explanatory in its name. When you have a light source, for example, the sun, it's going to cast very strong light rays down onto whatever surfaces that it can reach. Now this is your subject, and there are light rays traveling down this way. These rays are not going to stop as soon as they meet this surface. Some of that light ray will be absorbed into that surface, but some of it is going to bounce back up, and it's going to carry some of the colors here onto your subject. If you play games, it's kind of similar to ray tracing, right? Everything comes down in a straight line, bounces off surfaces, and reflects onto subjects that you see in the environment. Bounce light is one of the most crucial things to include if you want your subject to look like they're a part of an environment. And this is why if you look at, video game footage, for example, with the ray tracing technology, when there's bounce light being implemented, things look much more realistic. And as you can see on the right here, the first example is an oval egg shape hovering in the air without any application of bounce light whatsoever. Now this works. You can see that it's a three-dimensional object, but you can't really place it in an environment because there's no bounce light around it to inform you of what's surrounding this object. Whereas with egg number 2, we place it in an environment where there's color. And when the lighting is coming this way, you're going to get rays that come down, hits this surface, and some of it is going to bounce back up onto the surface that's underneath this egg. Same thing with the other side. You're going to get some light rays that hit this wall, and some of it is going to bounce back onto this side of the egg. And as you can see here, they're carrying the colors of the surfaces surrounding this object. So it really grounds whatever object you have in your environment and makes it a part of an entire scene. Now let's apply some bounce light to our portrait here. The first thing I want to do is I want to determine where the light source is coming from. So one of the most common bounce light scenarios is when there is strong sunlight hitting a subject or hitting the ground near a subject, and the light kind of bounces back up onto the surfaces on the subject that are facing down. So that's what I'm going to try to do here. I'm going to try to apply a bounce light scenario where the bounced light is coming from underneath. Now, one of the main surfaces that's going to be facing downwards is the underside of the jaw. I'm going to use a bright and vibrant orange color to kind of get the sense across that this is a very warm and powerful light. And instead of that very harsh kind of application like we did for rim light, for this one, we want to go with more of a glazing kind of approach. And you can see just how softly this light is able to blend into its surroundings. So the closer we get to the ground, the more of this bounce light you're going to see. And we have to keep in mind, which surfaces are facing downwards and which surfaces are going to be receiving the light. The top side of the collarbones, for example, will not be receiving this light because it's coming from below and it won't reach the top of the collarbone. And then as we come down to this bottom half of the face, you're probably going to get some of this bounce light on the side of the cheeks, and very notably you're also going to get that on the underside of the brow ridge. So as you get more detailed, you can start working smaller and smaller. You can start getting the underside of the nose with this nice hit of bright orange, get the upper lip, the underside of the lower lip, and you can start to really differentiate the different facial features. So just like that. And if you happen to have, let's say, a lime green wall on the left side of the character, then you're gonna get some kind of reflection of that color as well, right? So you want to keep in mind, what is the environment that my character is placed in, and how does it affect the lighting and the colors on my character? And just like that, you can see with this little hint of green, we can infer that the character is standing somewhere where there's a green surface next to them. Bounce light is one of the best ways to inform your viewer of the environment that's surrounding a character without having to show that environment. And last but not least, let's talk about ambient light. This one's a bit tricky because it often gets mixed up with bounce light because it's also a very soft and very glazed kind of light. What ambient light basically refers to is it's not the primary light source. So for example, here you have the sun and it's casting a bright light onto your subject. But if this environment was free of ambient light, that would mean that the shadow would be completely dark on your subject. But we really don't see this unless we're in a photo studio specifically designed to create this effect. So what often happens is, especially when it's outdoors, the sky is blue, and that blue is going to be cast onto our subject in the form of ambient light. So you're really going to see a lot of subjects where the shadow looks kind of bluish when you're outside, and that's because of the ambient light hitting the shaded area on your subject. This is why a lot of artists say that shadows are not the complete absence of any light whatsoever. Instead, the objects and the three-dimensional shapes that you have in shadows are often informed by the ambient light that's actually in the environment. So what we can see here is this cloth is free of any ambient light, whereas this one here has blue light being cast onto it from the sky. The difference here is this cloth tells me that there is only one light source in this environment, whereas this cloth tells me there are two light sources in this environment. One is the primary sunlight, the other is the light from the sky. So once again, this light is used to tell you more about the environment that your subject is situated in. Now I'm going to pick out a nice blue color, and I'm going to show you guys how you might apply ambient light onto a subject. Now let's just say the light is coming from here, up top. What I want to do is, once again, I want to think of what surfaces are on this subject that are facing that light. If the light is coming from this direction, you're not going to get blue on this side of the head, because it's just simply out of the way, and light always travels in straight lines. So in this case, we're going to get a nice soft glaze of ambient blue on one side of our character. And once you have this down, you can go into a bit more detail and pick out the areas where that blue wouldn't hit. For example, underneath the brow ridge, underneath the nose, under the upper lip, and some of it underneath the neck. Once we're happy with that, we can make this ambient light even brighter, even more vibrant, give it some more depth. For example, right here on the cheek, you can see now there's a bit more contrast between the light and the dark. And this very soft kind of blue glow is going to be our ambient light being cast from the sky. Now, it doesn't have to be always from the sky. If your character is in like a rainforest or something under a bunch of green trees, you might get something that looks a bit more green. So if we turn our hue slider, you might get something that looks a bit more like that, because the leaves are casting a very green kind of ambience onto everything on the forest floor. So it depends on the environment, and it's always going to take into account the ambient environment that's surrounding your character. So that was a quick intro into these lighting scenarios so that you understand how they work. Now I'm going to show you guys real life examples as well as examples in paintings, and I'll explain to you guys in some of these cases why they are so effectively placed and the kind of effect that it has on an overall scene. So a really effective way to understand these different lighting scenarios is to go out there, find actual references, find things in real life that show you where these lighting types occur. Now, just as a few quick examples, you can see in our first image, there's a very strong rim light hitting the right side of the character. And you can see some of that pass over here. And you're also going to get this bright rim along the ear, which continues all the way down the back of the character. In this case, this application of light is very effective because it's helping separate the character from the dark background. You can see a very similar application here in this photograph. Now, the reason it's so striking is because not only do you have a beautiful pose for the main subject, you're also getting a very, very high contrast rim light on the side of the character's body. You can see the rim light also goes into detail and frames the expression on the face. Now, what this is doing once again is having this very bright silhouette. It separates our main focus from the dark background. And if you pay attention to the use of rim light, you're going to see a lot of this in films, in photographs, and in a lot of artists' work. It's a really, really effective way to draw attention to a main subject. For example, this bright color that you see here is a direct reflection of the light hitting the book and then bouncing back up to hit the face, the underside of the brows, the eyes, the underside of the nose of our subject. The only reason all of this is brighter than what you see here is because these surfaces face downward more than the surfaces up here. And right below these surfaces, there is a very, very bright reflective book that is casting bounce light back up. Now let's continue with this exercise and take a look at this image right here. Now, the most obvious application of bounce light, I would say, is right here in the shape of these kind of folds that are at the bottom in the shadow. What you're going to notice here is that this is much more yellowish in its hue when compared to, let's say, this shadow here. You can see coming here, it gets more saturated, more yellow compared to this. Now, if you've been paying attention for the first part, you probably know that's because of the yellow wall behind our subject. So having this bounce light here, it's going to inform us of the different shapes that are present in the shadow. And not only that, it's going to place our subject in relation to the environment. It's going to set your subject into its surroundings. If you want to go into a bit more detail, you can see there's that bounce light right there as well. And as we go upwards, there's also a bounce light on the bottom side of the jaw, and that's coming from this bright spot right here. The bright light is going to come down, bounce back up, and hit this surface that would otherwise be in shadow. So once you're able to master bounce light, you can really understand how to set your subject into an environment and make it look believable. And of course, most of the time, bounce light is going to occur in the shadow regions on your subject. So for example, here, that's in shadow. The bounce light here is occurring in shadow, and the bounce light on the jaw here is also occurring in shadow. And now let's search for a bit of ambient light. The most obvious example I can see here is this blue hue on the forehead of our character. You can see the regular skin tone is within the warm color range, but as soon as we go up here, now we're within the purples and the blues. Again, your skin is not blue. The only reason this blue is occurring is because of the sky in the background. It's casting a blue light onto the surface of the forehead. You're also going to see this bluish kind of hue in the hair right there. That's very much blue. Now, as we get down to this image right here where there is white fabric, you're going to see even more of that. The fabric that is in shadow is now appearing very much blue. And once again, shadow is not the complete absence of light. The shadow only reflects the ambient light in the environment, where you can see the main light source is from the sun, but the secondary light source is this blue from the sky. But it doesn't always have to be blue. So if we look at this example, you can see there's a bright light source here, but the top of the head that the bright light source does not touch is also lit. And it's being lit by this very turquoise looking kind of light. And you can see that here on the neck as well. And that shows that the ambient light in this environment is a little bit different from just a pure blue sky. This kind of turquoise ambient light might also reflect the surroundings of our subject. So now, having taken a look at these real life scenarios, now we're going to look at some artworks. Now, oftentimes in art, you're going to see these types of lighting be very exaggerated. And studying that sometimes can tell us a lot about the way different artists like to approach lighting scenarios. So with this skull right here, you can see that it's sitting on a red surface, and there's a lot of red being cast onto the bottom facing surfaces on the skull. Now, if I were to erase any hint of this red in its environment, here, just with this image, you can still tell that the skull is being lit by something red that's really close to it. And this is what I mean by bounce light being able to tell you a lot about the environment that's surrounding your subject without that environment actually having to be depicted. If your character has a teal color on the underside of their facial features, like this, you might be able to assume that this character was standing in front of a pool of water. So the lighting that you apply, especially when it comes to bounce light, can tell you a lot about the immediate surroundings of your character. But with this painting on the left, I want to show you guys the use of ambient light here. In a lot of these painterly pieces, you're going to see very saturated colors being applied to areas where you wouldn't really expect to see them. But this is really just the stylization and exaggeration of ambient light that's coming from the environment surrounding your character. The reason that this blue is here is because there's something in the environment casting this blue color onto our character. If we were to get the same blue ambient light from this image over to the skull, what you might see is going to look something like this. Again, just very subtle glazing hints of a blue light that's reaching the surface of the subject. And this blue light might also carry over onto the environment around our subject. So with a blue ambient light, it might look something like that. Now I want to go through some more examples with you guys. So here are a couple of paintings from Aaron Blaze, who's absolutely fantastic at drawing animals. Now you can see a beautiful golden light casting down onto the fur of this bear, and there's a really great separation between light and shadow. But what's interesting is as you come down to the very bottom of the shadow right here, you're getting a bit of green. Now you might be wondering, what does that mean? Why is that green? Well, think about the environment that a bear might be in. We can assume that the sunlight coming from the top is also going to reach whatever is around the bear, and a bear would be out in nature. So this greenish kind of hue is inferring that there is grass underneath the bear, and the grass is being lit up and it's casting a bounce light to the bottom side of the bear's neck. The way you apply a bounce light can really tell you a lot about the environment. You can see that on the underside of the arm here, there's another patch of bright orange, and on this leg, another patch of bright orange. That's bounce light coming from the ground. You're also going to see that while this part of the bear is in a very dark shadow, this area right here is being lit up, and that is coming from the ambient light in the sky. So again, very meticulous attention to detail when it comes to lighting in an environment for a subject. And here are some stylized paintings by Ramon. Now what I want to draw your attention to is, even though the rendering overall is quite simple on these characters, there is a really effective use of rim lighting on these characters. In this case, what Ramon is using rim lighting to do is it's separating the character from the background. It's bringing attention to the silhouette, to the shapes. You can see that the light follows the form of the faces of our characters. Even right here, you can see a triangular shape following the cheekbone, coming down onto the mustache, and then following the shape of the chin. It's very geometrical. And again, it's not uniform. It's thin here and it gets thicker here. It's following the form of the hair of our character Littlefinger. Now, if you were to take out any hint of a rim lighting here, your character starts to fade into the background. If we were to remove this white rim on the faces of our characters, just look at the difference that makes. Especially with a similarly colored background, your character starts to just fade. And if we zoom out, you can see you're losing the silhouette of your character. Whereas if we turn that off, now immediately you can see just how much contrast there is between the foreground and the background because of this effective application of rim light. And here are a couple of my paintings where I want to point out some areas where I thought about using rim light, ambient light, and bounce light. So let's go over to the one with Kara on the left. The first thing I want to point out is the use of bounce light. Notice the bright orange on the underside of the nose. The only reason that's occurring is because there's a bounce light coming back up, and the bounce light is originating from the page on the book. Now, some of this light is also going to come onto the hair. You can see there's a bit more yellow here, and some of it will also reach the underside of the neck. And now, obviously, this is a very exaggerated kind of example, but you can see the logic that I'm following when it comes to applying these vibrant colors. Again, we're focusing on surfaces that are facing downwards because the bounce light is coming from an angle that's below the face. So things such as the brow ridge, which is facing down, that's going to be lit up. Things such as the underside of the lower lip, that's going to be lit up. But that's really not all. You're also going to be able to see ambient light in this environment. Because she is on a bus and behind this window is the great wilderness of nature, what you're getting here is an application of blue ambient light from the color of the sky. And you can see it gets a bit stronger here and gets a little bit weaker here because that's not being lit directly by the sky. It's facing the inside of the bus. Looking over at the book here, you can also see this shape of blue light coming from the sky. And we can see the same thing occurring on the window ledge on the bus. So the surfaces that are facing upwards this time are catching that ambient light because that light source is coming from the sky. And now with the piece on the right, what we're focusing on is rim lighting and ambient lighting. The rim lighting here is done in a greenish kind of tone, and it's used in contrast with the very warm, almost reddish tone for the skin color and for the colors of the shadow. And now if you think about it, green and red are complementary colors, so these kind of go together and create a very harmonious composition. And this rim light also helps us separate our character from the background. If we didn't have this rim light, once again, like what we've discussed before, the silhouette of your character will kind of just start fading into whatever is behind it. And you no longer have a sense that there is separation between your foreground and your background. And if we turn our attention over to the side of our character's face, you can see a greenish color being cast onto this area. This is part of the ambient light in our environment, and you can see a very similar color right here in the background. So it kind of makes sense why there would be a green being applied onto the side of the face of our character in the area where it's in shadow. And once again, these are following the forms and the shapes. You can see that it's following this kind of contour of the cheekbone. It's following this contour of the jaw. It's following the shape of the neck. Before you put down a brushstroke for a patch of, say, ambient light like this, ask yourself, why am I applying this light? Why does this light appear here and not, let's say, over here? Now, for the piece on the right, we're not seeing much bounce light, but let's just say we put a really bright blue surface right close to the face of the character. What's going to happen here is this blue light is going to carry over onto the surfaces that are facing it. So for example, the bottom side of the jaw, you might even get some on the bottom side of the lower lip, you might get some on the bottom side of the nose, on the bottom side of the eyelid, and of course the brow ridge. We're thinking about the direction that the light is coming from. Light is always traveling in straight lines, okay? So that makes it much simpler. You only have to understand, okay, if it's coming from here, it's gonna hit this surface here. If it's coming from here, it's gonna hit this surface here. If the light is coming from the bottom, it's not gonna hit the top of the head. So it's a bit of a mental exercise to try to three-dimensionalize and try to see where the light is gonna reach and where it's not gonna be able to reach. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into some examples. So I really love this image here. Even though it's not much of a close-up, it's not super clear what's going on the faces, I think this gives you a really good context as to, why the lighting scenario is the way it is. So for example, let's take a look at the rim light on the characters. You can see that the light is coming from a top-down kind of rear angle. So it's lighting up the sidewalk here and the walls, and you can even see that there's a ray of light kind of tracing the direction of where the original light source is coming from. The rim lighting here is sunlight, so it's going to be very powerful, but it's not the only light in this environment. We're also going to see bounce light. So because this area is so bright, some of that light is going to be cast back up onto our subjects. So right here, as we come down, you can see this blue color slowly get brighter and move higher up in terms of its value. If it weren't for the sunlight hitting the ground here, this would be as dark as that. And we're getting a similar thing here. You can see even though her lower body is in shadow, this area is very bright. And that's because she's wearing a light colored clothing that's being lit by the bounce light on the ground. So some of that is casting back up onto this side. Whereas on this side, you can see there's no bright light source, so everything is relatively dark. Now let's go into our illustration and actually apply what we see. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna apply the shape of our rim light. The rim light here is going to allow me to separate our subject from the background and create a very striking silhouette. Now remember, the rim light is not going to be uniform around the entire silhouette of our character. You can see it's quite thick up top, but it gets really thin on the side. And this just has to do with the shape that the light is being cast onto. So there's the top, and let's get the side right there, and it gets really thin as we get down to the side. Same thing on the other side, it's going to get nice and thin. And here what's interesting is at the bottom of her hairpiece, you're going to see a lot of bounce light that's coming from the ground. This light here is not as bright as the rim light. If we were to apply a really bright color, it might create some kind of a weird effect. So we want to go a bit darker, and we can just gently glaze this in here with a bit of a gradient. So now after having applied this is going to inform us that there's some sort of lighting coming from the bottom, and it really makes sense of this strong light from the top. Now I'm going to take the original color for the rim lighting, and I'm going to just carry it through the entire body. I'm going to get a bright edge there, and we're going to get a really bright edge on that fabric there, just like that. And again, following the shape of what you see. So I would say at this point we have a really solid kind of lighting scenario for the rim light. Now what we have to do is we have to apply the bounce light. Now you can see the bounce light is right there, and it gets really bright in certain areas. So taking this shadow color, we're gonna move it a bit brighter in terms of its value, change up the hue a bit, and we're gonna take a nice glazing brush. Now once again, we're gonna follow the shapes of the surfaces that you see on the face. Just like that, a nice gentle glaze. You don't want it to be too bright, because then you can start to confuse it with your main light source. This is, after all, a secondary light source when you compare it to the main light, which is coming from the back, which is in the form of sunlight. So here what we're going to get is this bounce light coming from the left side, and it's going to light up some of the features on the left side of the face of our character. Now once you're happy with it, you can go in and apply a bit of blending. Usually for me, when it comes to bounce light, I like to make the saturation a little bit more exaggerated. So for example, you can see on his face here, there seems to be a bit more saturation than you see here, but I want to exaggerate that. I want to go a little bit more saturated, right? Using the same brush, same kind of glazing technique. I want to just bring this color out. Now you don't have to do this part, but the reason I like to include this step where I add a more saturated color is because it sometimes almost makes the drawing look like it's glowing. So I'm going to go and move up towards the yellows here, and once we're happy with the gist of this lighting scenario, we can kind of come in here and add smaller details that you see, for example on the side of the nose. Again, I'm going a bit more saturated than what you see in the image, but that's just kind of how I like to work. If you prefer your drawings to be a bit more desaturated, by all means, you know, it'll make sense as long as your light is in the right position. So again, adding that bright edge right there, just like that. It almost looks like it's glowing. So that's kind of how I would approach the rim light and the bounce light. The rim light, very harsh, very direct. Do not be hesitant. But the bounce light, you want it to be soft, you want it to be glazed, and you want it to really inform the shapes that you see in the shadows. Now, last but not least, we have to apply ambient lighting. And because this is an outdoor scene, we're gonna get a bit of blue. And you can see that blue right there on the head. So I'm gonna take a nice, decently saturated blue and get some of that onto the top facing surfaces of the hair. Just like that. And we're gonna kind of brush back into it, right? Create this hint of detail in the shadows. And just like that, let's apply another glaze of blue. So things start to look like they kind of belong in the environment. Having done that blue, now I'm going to carry some of that down onto the face. I'm going to go a bit brighter. And once again, it's a very, very soft glaze onto the features to a point where you almost don't see it, but it does make a difference. And of course, we have to apply that onto what we see down here on the fabric as well. Especially white fabric, it's going to really reflect whatever colors that you see in the environment. Then coming down here, this is more of a yellowish kind of fabric. Just like that. So I'm gonna cast some bounce light onto it. Some shadow there. And just like that, we have our lighting scenario comprised of rim light, bounce light, and ambient light. Now, one thing that I like to do to kind of finalize the lighting in my pieces is I like to pick out a nice bright color that reflects the lighting that you see in the environment. And I usually go with an airbrush or the round brush. We're gonna make a new layer, set it to hard light blend mode. You can try out some of the other ones too, like overlay or soft light. It just depends on what you need. But here we're gonna use hard light. I'm gonna just brush this golden yellow color onto the areas where there's a very strong light source. So kind of like that. We're gonna get a bit on the rim light on the robes here. And if you go a bit overboard, take your eraser and kind of clean up the edges a bit. And there we go. Now if you want a bit more punch to your bounce light, we're gonna start an overlay layer. We're gonna pick out a color that kind of resembles the color of the bounce light. And again, using the airbrush, we can kind of bring out the brightness in certain areas of the face. Now, obviously, you want this to be a bit more detailed. You're gonna have to go back in and kind of clean up some of the edges. But that's kind of the gist of it. So without this layer, you can see it looks like that. But with the layer, it's a little bit more punchy. It really brightens up the color. So with an overlay layer for the bounce light and a hard light layer for the rim light, we have completed our lighting scenario. Now all that's left to do is to really just apply the details and finish up rendering your piece. So this is example one of how to study lighting scenarios that you see in real life. And I'm gonna give you guys some reference images that you can download and try to use for your own practice. But overall, the process is you wanna take a look at a reference, try to identify if there is a rim light, if there's a bounce light, if there is ambient light, try to separate each element. And as we approach our study of that reference, you want to kind of separate them into individual steps. So the first thing I did here was I set out the rim light for our character so that we know the general gist of the lighting. And the step after that, we took the bounce light that we see in the environment and glazed it over the face of the character onto the surfaces where you see that color. And of course, last but not least, we applied a glaze for the ambient light in the environment. So you want to separate things, and kind of like what I said in my latest YouTube video, you want to do one thing at a time. But we're not going to stop at studies. Once you get more comfortable with that, you can start playing around with different lighting scenarios for your drawings, for your characters. So this here is a really quick example that I put up of a different lighting scenario that you can apply to an existing drawing. And it really is very simple. First layer is a multiply that changes the overall value of this drawing. And the second layer is a combination of a rim light and an ambient light that really sets the scene for the environment that this character is in. So you can see the difference here from the first image, which is much warmer and much sunnier, to the second image where we changed the lighting scenario. Now it's become much more dramatic and it almost looks like kind of dark and mysterious. And that's the power of using these different lighting scenarios to your advantage. Now I want to show you guys some ways that you can experiment with this once you get more comfortable with your studies. And I want to show you just how much of a difference it can make on your painting. So the first one, we're going to go with a multiply layer, and I've set this to a clipping mask, which means when I paint onto it, it won't go outside of the character. So I'm gonna take my glazing round brush and we're gonna just darken the entire piece. What I want to do for this one is I want to create a rim light and bounce light kind of lighting scenario. And that of course is going to involve casting our character's face in shadow. So that was the first step. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and erase away some of this multiply layer so that we can give the bounce light a bit of context. Now I'm going to apply my bounce light from, once again, the bottom up. So the surfaces that are going to be facing downwards are going to catch most of this bounce light. You don't have to use a normal blend mode. For bounce light, you can also just start off with hard light, or you could start off with an overlay. So let's try overlay for this piece. Now you can see that immediately starts to look like it's glowing. There we go. Now let's get a bit of that on the bottom side of the lip and kind of an overall glaze on the bottom half of the face. Now let's get some more on the outside of the cheek. Again, the surfaces that are going to be kind of facing downwards, going in a different angle, that are going to be catching most of the light. Let's get some more of that on the lower lip. And of course, we're going to come down and we're going to come up here to the underside of the brows, just like that. Let's brighten up this chest area and the underside of the jaw there. So here's the overlay blend mode, and I think that looks pretty good, but we can try to see if any of the other ones work even better. And I want to say this one and hard light both look very good too. And pin light here looks really good too. So it's really up to you the kind of effect that you want to create. So I'm going to go with vivid light because I really like the way that looks. So you guys can see the bounce light here really makes sense because we're placing it on the surfaces facing downwards. And we're giving it a bit of context by applying this bright sunlight onto the bottom half of our character's torso. So with this bit of context, you can understand why the bounce light is coming from below. And I want to get a bit of that kind of bounce light onto the ears and the surfaces that are facing down, just like that. And some of it is going to be on the hair as well. And of course, now because our character is entirely in shadow, we're going to have to consider how to bring this character out of the background a bit more. And that's where our rim light comes in. So I'm going to take a sharp brush, get a really bright color. I'm going to use blue in this case because the primary light source is golden and I want something to kind of contrast that. So using this blue, we can kind of follow the forms and the shapes on the silhouette of our character's hair. And of course, you have to think about the direction in which the light is coming from. Now in this case, I'm putting the light like really, really close to just behind the character. It's not really lighting up too much, but it's creating a nice, strong silhouette, just like that. And some of it is going to carry over to this side. And remember to add some variation in the thickness of your rim light so that it's more believable. Following the shape of the hair, some of it's going to come down like that. And if you want, you can add some loose strands here and there just to provide even more context. Let's come back in here and blend out our bounce light, soften it up a bit. So with that being done, you can see that we've really transformed the lighting scenario from the original to this one by using bounce light and rim light. Now, while I didn't intentionally apply an ambient light to the scenario, you can see that the shadow is kind of lit up by this bluish gray color, and I think that serves its purpose as the ambient light. The ambience in this piece is really just a kind of grayish muted color. If there was no ambience, all of this would be in complete shadow. Now let's go over to the one on the left. Let's try to do a slightly different lighting scenario. I'm going to start off once again by turning this layer into multiply since we're trying to work with some rim light here. I prefer my characters to be in shadow. Let's go for a warmer kind of shadow, and I'm going to try to make the rim light on this one appear a little bit green. See if we can pull this off. So there's the shadow, and it's quite dark, and it's set to multiply on a clipping mask. Now for this one, I want to apply a rim light from the right side. And I want this rim light to be a little bit green. So we're gonna take this greenish color, and again, we're gonna determine where the light source is coming from. I want this one to be at like a 3/4 angle coming from this side and hitting the side of the head. So that would mean that we're gonna need this color to kind of fall onto the shape of the hair. It's gonna wrap onto the top of the head a bit, and we're gonna get some of that green down here where it's going to kind of shine through some of the strands of hair. And this is where you can get into a lot of detail. So just like that, right, we can get some more of this green inside here, just following the shape of the hair. And this angle is going to be a bit trickier to work with because at this kind of a 3/4 angle for the light, we're going to see a lot more surfaces being lit up by this rim light. And just like that, I think that edge is looking quite good. Want to extend that light down to the shoulder here. Once again, following the contours of the shapes that you see. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that same green color and get that onto the outside of the ear. And I really like doing rim light on the ear because you can get a lot of nice translucency in the inside on the cartilage of the ear. You can kind of make it look like there's light shining through. And it gives your characters a really lifelike feel. And I don't want to stop this light just there. I want to get a hint of it on the skin as well. So I want to kind of reflect this color onto the side plane of the head. Just like that. And we're going to just soften this up. So on the surface here, the reason I'm applying this bright color is because this is the plane of the temple. And that plane is facing the side. So just like that, you're getting a bit of green on this surface right here. And of course, some of that's going to come down to the cheek. Applying it once again, blending it out. And then for this one, I want to try to apply a reddish ambient light, almost like she's on a street with a lot of neon signs. So I'm assuming the light's going to be coming from up top because it's from a neon sign. So let's get some of that red onto the surfaces that are facing the top. Just like that, we're going to come back in and refine. Getting it a little bit more saturated here, a little bit brighter, just like that. We're going to blend this out, and using our sharper brush, we're going to go into a bit more detail. So following some of the shapes on the hair, once again, refining as we go, and we're also going to follow the shape of the nose. Again, keeping in mind the direction that the light is coming from. Let's get a bit of that red on the cheek right there, blending it out as we go because ambient light usually is very soft. Get a little bit of it on this side as well, and then once again, blending it out as we go, and a little bit here on the top side of the mouth, a little bit on the chin right there. We're just going to soften that up, blend it out, and I think honestly that looks pretty good. So we're gonna bring this down a bit more, give it some more context. I'm really imagining that she is standing on a street with neon signs, and there's a really bright green one behind her and kind of a more muted red one in front of her. And with this type of lighting scenario, you can really get down to the small details. For example, the highlight in the eyes. You can get a little bit of a red speck there, just to show that there's red lighting coming from in front of her. And again, it provides context to the environment. Last but not least, we're doing this on a normal blend mode. But if you want, you can try to see if any other blend modes would work better for this lighting scenario. So there's lighten, screen, color dodge, which I don't really like. And here's soft light and hard light. I think hard light works really, really well for this lighting scenario. So we're gonna go with that. Now you can see this is hard light, this is before. So you're getting way more saturation here, and that's exactly what I want. And there we go. There's a completely different lighting scenario in a completely different environment using rim light and ambient light. So there's these two and this one. And once you're happy with your studies based on photographs and based on things in real life, feel free to jump into this because it really is a lot of fun trying to play around with different lighting scenarios and understanding how they work. Because once you get the grasp of rim light, bounce light, ambient light, and you're able to separate them, you're able to work on them in your studies, lighting scenarios as a whole just become much more comprehensible to you. You're going to have a much easier time understanding how lighting is working in any given environment, and you're going to be able to kind of come up with your own lighting scenarios just out of thin air. So once again, we want to start off with references. We want to learn from what we see in real life. Once you get really comfortable with that, you can start experimenting. You can try out different lighting scenarios, different colors, things that you might have in your mind. And I'll tell you guys right now, once you're familiar with this concept, once you've mastered it, it's so much fun to just try out different things on a character that you've drawn. And sometimes, if you don't have a drawing on hand, you could even practice with references. You could be like, okay, what if there was an orange bounce light being cast from the bottom onto our character? Then you can take your glazing brush and you can kind of experiment and see what that might look like on your character. See if you can try to make it convincing by painting onto a reference, a lighting scenario that's not already there. So there you guys go. I hope you were able to absorb the information in regards to these different types of lighting scenarios, why they occur, where they occur, and also I hope I was able to give you guys a better understanding of how to apply them into your drawings and kind of the effects that they can achieve. For example, with these two illustrations here, they really give you a different feel about the environment around the character. They can be very, very moody. So I want you guys to go ahead and try it out. If you're not comfortable with this, you can start off with simple shapes just to understand how the lighting is applied onto different surfaces. But as you get progressively more comfortable, you can move on from shapes onto portraits, onto actual complex subjects. Kind of just go through your studies and get comfortable finding these lighting scenarios in real life examples and applying them into a study of an image. And once you've got that down, you can start trying to apply these lighting scenarios to either reference images or to your own drawings and see what you can come up with. And it's really a lot of fun. And this entire process will really boost your understanding of lighting as a whole. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys, and I want to thank you guys once again for being here, for supporting me and everything that I do. Here's to a beautiful 2023 filled with drawing and learning and all that good stuff. So thank you guys for being here. Really appreciate you all, and I'll see you guys on the next tutorial.